Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. And dear students, Assalamu alaikum. Our next most important topic is about utilitarianism. First of all, I explain you briefly what is utilitarianism and about the concept of utilitarianism. If we historically examine, then we find out that as a theory of morals, this concept can be connected with the Epicureans school of ancient Greece. Then another most popular political philosopher, David Hume, promoted this idea. David Hume was considered real founder of utilitarianism. He is the first thinker who clearly presented principle of utility and provided basis upon which later philosophers Bentham and John Stuart Mill built their theories about utilitarianism. David Hume highlighted his concept about utilitarianism, about basic spirit of utilitarianism on the basis that men seek pleasure and avoid pain. This principle applies to all men because these feelings are universally shared. So, utilitarian political philosophy was based upon the English tradition in psychology as worked out by John Locke and David Hume. Its beginning appeared in the 17th century. Many thinkers of 17th century also wrote about the welfare of the peoples, about the greatest happiness of the greatest number of the peoples. So, concept of utilitarianism started from ancient to modern period in different phases. If we examine about basic major aspects, major features or characteristics of utilitarianism, then we very clearly find out that utilitarianism is an ethical theory. It is a theory about the nature and motives of human conduct and the standard of moral judgment. Bentham and J.S. Mill apply its principles as a theory of morals. And other features of utilitarianism are, first, the main objective of the utilitarianism is the greatest happiness of the greatest number of peoples. Major characteristic or major feature of utilitarianism is that it represents the interest in the welfare of mankind through effective state legislation process. Next, the method of utilitarianism is inductive. Its bases are experimental and its ends are practical and attainable. Next, utilitarian give primary importance not to the society or state but to the rights of the individuals. In this sense, they are individualists. According to utilitarian thinkers, individual is an integral part of society, welfare, betterment, moral dignity, moral aspects of individuals can be protected and promoted in the state and society. Next most important point or important feature or characteristic is that utilitarianism also a theory of government. The welfare of citizen is possible only and only through government. People always obey government. People obey laws only because laws, code and conducts, principles are in their own interest. Overall, utilitarianism, the concept of utilitarianism remained a very important concept in the history of Western political thought. Major utilitarian thinkers were Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. Our today's discussion is about most popular thinker, utilitarian thinker, Jeremy Bentham. Jeremy Bentham was an English utilitarian thinker. His period was 1748 to 1832. While discussing about concept of utilitarianism and philosophy of Jeremy Bentham, I briefly explained you about environment of that period. Utilitarianism was closely associated with psychology, with law, with economics, and with politics. Utilitarianism highlighted significant aspects of individuals in the society because each individual is largely determined by the social environment in which he lives. So, while discussing about the utilitarianism and discussing about the Jeremy Bentham, economic causes are very significant and economic causes cannot be denied during this discussion because in England, period of 1775 to 1875, which we can consider that it was an era of dynamic change. England was becoming an industrial nation, and the industrial middle class, the moving force behind this transition, was demanding a political role, and political role according to with their contributions, according to their proportions, and according to their commensurate. So, during these circumstances, when England was becoming an industrial state, industrial revolution of Europe, rising problems of urbanization, problems of unemployment, problems and basic rights and freedoms of laborer classes, and all these circumstances become a major cause for the development of the concept of utilitarianism. The utilitarians were far more optimistic, and many things could bring happiness, and it was important to permit as much individual freedom as possible in the search for happiness. In these circumstances, now we examine about Jeremy Bentham. I already explained you period of Jeremy Bentham 1748 to 1832. Jeremy Bentham was not only an English utilitarian thinker, he was also an intellectual leader, legal reformer, and founder of concept of utilitarianism. He also actively participated in public affairs, covered the period from the American Revolution to the Reform Bill of 1832. His major contributions, his major writings are: number 1, Fragment on Government; next, Defense of Usury; next, Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation; and next, the principles about political economy, or Manual of Political Economy. All these were his major contributions in the history of Western political thought. The principle of utility is the heart of Bentham's philosophy. He introduced a vast range of social, political, legal reforms on the basis of the principle of utility. Utilitarian ideas have had a considerable impact upon liberalism, and due to these ideas, he strongly supported representative democracy. Bentham's ideas formed the basis of philosophical radicalism, which was responsible for many of the reforms in social administration and in economies of states, in laws, and in government, different aspects. Bentham also developed scientific views in the form of moral philosophical system based upon the principle of utility. Now we shall examine Bentham's proceeds about the principle of utility, or in other words, we can say that Bentham defines principle of utility very comprehensive and in a very brief way. In inverted commas, we can define his definition of his views of principle of utility greatest happiness of the greatest number of peoples. I repeat it again, greatest happiness of the greatest number of peoples. He explained that this principle measures of right and wrong in the society. The term utility stands for usefulness of ideas, all aspects such as institutions, liberty, security, basic rights, and people's other rights protected or affected by the state. Bentham clearly explained that nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasures. Jude Harman, a famous writer of book Political Thought from Plato to the Present, Jude Harman explained different kinds of pleasure and pains. Bentham clearly explained there are 14 simple pleasures such as sense, wealth, skill, amity, good name, power, piety, benevolence, malevolence, memory, imagination, expectation, association, and relief. He further explained there are 12 simple pains: privation, senses, awkwardness, enmity, ill name, piety, benevolence, malevolence, memory, imagination, expectation, and association. His classification, his categorization, his different kinds of pain and pleasures explained his views about his principle of utility. He also explained that a legislator is responsible for the calculation the consequences for the community of a particular period of legislation, and legislation must be aware of complications which stem from the existence of many kinds of pain and pleasure. So, for this purpose, he explained different kinds of pains and pleasures. He further explained that every human action is motivated by the desire to obtain as much pleasure and avoid as much pain as possible. Bentham is quite aware of the fact that an application of the principle of utility is not so simple. A legislator should be responsible for the application of this principle. There are more varieties of pain and pleasures. The problem is highly complex. Government has authority to act to produce the greatest happiness of the greatest number. Bentham proceeds clearly that by the principle of utility is meant that principle which approves or disapproves of every action whatsoever according to the tendency which it appears to have, augment or diminish the happiness of the party whose interest is in question, or what is the same thing in other words, to promote or to oppose that happiness. He further explained that I say of every action whatsoever, and therefore not only of every action of a private individual, but of every measure of government. Bentham further explained that government has authority to act to produce greatest happiness of the greatest number of people. Now, there is a question that what measures can be taken for the judgment of pleasure and pain and greatest happiness of the greater number of the peoples. According to Bentham, happiness can be judged by institutions and by the legislative procedures, by the laws, by the policies of the government. In his famous book, The Fragment on Government, he clearly explained that man should be informed by government with respect to what is being done and why. They have a right to know and a right to protest and oppose, because public interest always should be superior. Bentham further explained that during this process, role of public opinion cannot be denied, because pressure of public opinion should be considered important. So, governmental policies, governmental decisions, their implication, their welfare programs for peoples can be judged by feedback of the peoples and by the public opinion. Principle of utility could be applied to society at large and not to merely individual human behavior. Institutions and legislative can judge by the yardstick of the greatest happiness of the greatest number of people. Utilitarian ideas can be considered liberal because liberals believe that each and every individual should be entitled to pursue his or her own interest, not just those who happen to be in the majority. The strict application of Bentham's principle of utility can, therefore, liberal fear majority tyranny and other aspects of this philosophy. During this discussion, most important aspect is that using the greatest happiness principle, Bentham developed a justification for free trade, for laissez-faire economic, constitutional reforms, and democratic values, radical reforms, and political reforms in this regard. Government policy of non-interference with individual action in trade and commerce. Bentham denied the existence of natural law, and that law is the expression of sovereign will of political society in the form of command. He criticized existing laws of that period. In England, most of the laws reforms since Bentham's period can be traced his great influence. In other words, we can very simply explain here that many reforms in England influenced by the philosophy of Jeremy Bentham. He strictly criticized the injustice, severity of punishment provided in the criminal laws and the system of prison administration. He considered all these conditions intolerable. He urged a system of education as useful labor for criminals. Bentham was a very kind person by nature. He had a very sympathetic nature. Bentham's doctrines were widespread in different parts of the world, such as Russia, Portugal, Spain, and South America, and different other countries. And his ideas were followed by the leaders of the different national movements. In 1822, he appealed to all nations professing liberal opinions. His confidence in his ability to create a system of laws guaranteed to promote the greatest good of the greatest number of peoples was unbounded. Some of these terms used by Bentham, international, utilitarian, codification, and minimize, have permanently enriched the English language and literature. While concluding on topic of Bentham, we mention here that although Bentham did not live to witness the adoption in England of many of the reforms he so strongly urged, but a great number of his followers did. In 1832, the Reform Act gave representation for the first time to new industrial towns such as Leeds, Manchester, and Birmingham, and increased the franchise by 50%. Before this, industrial workers have no right of vote. So that was a greatest contribution of the Jeremy Bentham. In 1835, the Municipal Corporation Act vastly improved city government. As the years passed, there were many other reforms, and it would be fair to say that in all cases where the hand of reform touched, it was guided by the spirit of Bentham. Such was the tremendous influence which Bentham contributed in the history of political thought. Bentham's writings became popular in different countries of the world. His influence widely spread abroad. In England, free trade and the humanitarian movements owed much to the Bentham. He also gave the right of for the labor class about trade union. Overall, while concluding this topic of Jeremy Bentham as a utilitarian thinker, he considered and he remained as a most important English utilitarian thinker who laid the foundations for the concept of utilitarianism. And that is the end of this discussion.